Good morning, dear friends. Welcome. Thanks for joining. Today is Thursday, the first day of Cheshvan, Rosh Chodesh Mar Cheshvan, the 7th of October. We're studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Meseches Shabbos, Perek Shmini, chapter 8. We're on Ayin Tes Samad days. That's 79b. Today, just want to mention a little bit of a longer dedication than usual. Today, we're learning, in addition to all of the recent and frequent ones, today's also my grandfather Mordechai ben Nachum Tzviak Cohen's yahrzeit. So I want to mention his name. Dedicated learning Lilui Nishmasai. In addition to mentioning davening for Shlema for Leah Basrita, Rav Shimon Alevi ben Leah, and learning Lilui Nishmas, Daniel Yerachmiel ben Gedalia, and Aryeh Yaakov ben Litman, the Neshama Shabbat Leah, and Klal Yisrael, all types of good news. And so now let's get started. As we pull up the screen, a reminder, yesterday we spent a long time on a few words. We were talking about, well, our Gemara has been talking about the volume, the amounts, the sizes of stuff that you're not allowed to carry because it's useful, it's functional, you want it. And those are usually, that is the deciding factor of if you can or cannot carry it. Not to say that you should carry something smaller, but one might not be chayiv for desecrating Shabbos, certainly not biblically. And so we've been talking about how much leather is the smallest amount of leather. And then the Mishnah talks about how much cloth is the smallest piece of cloth. And it turns out that it's possible that there's a difference between the smallest size of parchment, depending on which part of the parchment or which kind of parchment it is. If it's the inner parchment, the outer parchment, the parchment closer to the exterior, to the interior. And so yesterday we started, or really we looked at a Gemara we'd studied the day prior, right? So today is Thursday, Wednesday, so Tuesday, I guess we read the Gemara about leather, about the oil, and we talked about the different, if it was processed or not processed, if it was tanned, if it was dry, if it was boiled. That was that discussion. And then yesterday, 2 days ago, we started talking about leather. And so yesterday, we spent our time reviewing the text, the very beginning of the next Gemara, and the text that describes and seems to give a definition of klaf versus duchsustos, parchment that's made from the interior, the exterior. And we took a look at Tosfos and the Rambam, and we went through some of that discussion. That was the bulk of yesterday, almost the entirety of yesterday's discussion. Today, we're going to get back to our question of which of those materials can be used for tefillin, which of those materials can be used for mezuzah. And Rav makes the assertion, Rav makes the statement that they are, duchsustos is like klaf. And the Gemara understood that to mean that you could use duchsustos for tefillin as well. And so we're going to go back to questioning Rav's position based on other texts, other sources, other discussions and references to the materials that we use as parchment. Before we start, I just want to share, I saw brought, in addition to yesterday, we presented it as possibly a question of quality. That was the primary question. I saw it described elsewhere, and this actually has a strong ring of truth, that it's possible that they were also stronger or more or less durable materials. So we can imagine that gevil, a single sheet that hasn't been split in half, it's going to be thicker. We can imagine that would be quite durable. And so you're going to want to have a Torah, which is frequently studied from and rolled and used. You want it to be from the most durable material, the unsplit parchment. Then apparently the understanding is that the parchment, the klaf, which is from the exterior, at least the way we explained it, would be more rugged and durable, and therefore you're going to want to use it for tefillin. And mezuzahs are made of the most soft material. And interestingly enough, it's brought in halacha that although if you follow the Chabad, if you're tradition or in general, people try to check their tefillin and mezuzahs in the Chabad tradition, ideally every year. The halacha Shulchan Aruch says you should try to check your mezuzahs and tefillin twice in 7 years. That is generally the more or a common approach to checking tefillin and mezuzahs. If I'm not mistaken, it's brought that tefillin really could be checked once in 70 years and mezuzahs once in 7 years. If that's an opinion that's brought in the Mishnah. If that's so, that might reflect not just the power and the staying power of the ksav, of the writing, but also of the durability and the odds of the parchment not breaking down. And so that's another possible way to understand the difference between these three materials. Dr. Hammer, you're going to add something?
Just a quick question, if I may. Maybe it's covered on Tuesday when I wasn't there. You mentioned, this is all because we're concerned with carrying on Shabbos and the size. You mentioned that there's a difference perhaps between the size of cloth versus the size of, our Greek cousin. Okay.
Yes.
And I don't understand why that would be. If we're talking about, it's a small amount, so you have to cut something. It's not like you're going to find an animal that size and take off their entire,
Right. No, so you're asking a good question. Thank you for asking. What we explained is that, first of all, it's possible that you had scraps. That's likely because we saw yesterday on the video, you have the whole animal, and that's a sheet. You might, most likely you're going to use that for a sheet in the Torah, maybe 2 sheets in the Torah. But now you have extra scraps. Can you cut that and make that into a square space? So that's how we might end up with a small piece of leather or a cloth, parchment. Now, as for the question of why cloth might be even smaller than doxustos, Doctor, I just hit mute, but if you're not taking the call, please unmute because I want to continue there. Here. So basically, depending on how many words you need to fit into that piece of paper, will depend on how small a paper will yet be useful. And again, Doctor, I'm sorry, I hit mute when the phone was ringing, but I want you to, if you're not on the phone, if he is on the phone, then. All right, anyways, I'll continue to explain. Basically, the issue is that the tefillin has 4 compartments, and there are 4 different segments of the Torah that are each written on those 4 compartments. The smallest of the 4 parshas, and also the best known, is Shema. So, however many words are in the paragraph of Shema, Mark, you know how many words are in the paragraph of Shema? Are you there? All right. Anyways, so however many words in the paragraph of Shema, that's how big a piece of paper or parchment you need to write those words. Now, what if you're going to decide that you need to tack to the bottom of Shema the second paragraph, which is V'haya im Shemaya? Is that going to be the same size, or it's going to be a larger size paper that can contain those 2 paragraphs of Shema? So, of course, it's going to be a much larger piece of paper or parchment. So now, if I'll tell you that one of those materials are exclusively used for tefillin, and one of these materials are exclusively used for mezuzahs, by definition, the one that you use tefillin for is useful even with smaller dimensions, whereas the material that's exclusively used for mezuzahs is going to need to be larger to contain all the words of the mezuzah. And so that's the conversation of if a scrap of cloth is a problem even if it's smaller than duchsustos, or if you can also use duchsustos for tefillin, well then even a smaller scrap can also be problematic for carrying on Shabbos, because even a small scrap is useful in the context of tefillin. That is how it's plausible that you might have different measurements for what is valuable of the 2 materials, depending on how they're used. And therefore, our question today is going to be, can you use duchsustos for tefillin? And if you can, then even a small scrap is a problem. If not, then it's only a bigger scrap. That's really the crux of our discussion today. Doctor, did I explain it clearly?
Yeah. Okay.
All right, so allow me, ask.
No, I understand. I understand. I absolutely understand.
Yeah. So again, a piece of paper that just has Shema is going to be shorter than a piece of paper with Shema and V'haya. Mezuzah equals Shema and V'haya. Tefillin equals down to the smallest parchment, which is just Shema. All right, let's take the Gemara from the top. And again, we're probing. Rav has a halachic, has an opinion, and we're probing his opinion. And I started it yesterday before we went into the whole klaf versus duchsustos conversation. Let's take it from the top. Amar Rav taught as follows: duchsustos harei hu kiklaf. Duchsustos, the meat parchment, that has the same treatment. It has the same halacha as klaf. What does that mean? Ma klaf kaisvin olav tefillin. Just as on klaf, you write the parchment, the portions that go into the tefillin. After duchsustos kaisvin olav tefillin, you can also use duchsustos for your tefillin. And if you can use duchsustos for tefillin, that means even a small scrap of duchsustos is problematic on Shabbos to carry. Is this so? The Gemara now is going to challenge it. Now, Mishnah says, kalaf, how big must the kalaf be? Okay, let me back up for a moment. Rav's comment wasn't stated in the context of Shabbos. It has implications for Shabbos. It also has implications for the laws, obviously, of tefillin and mezuzahs. So we can imagine that Rav's comment was made in the context of the laws of tefillin and mezuzahs, but it's being introduced here initially and primarily because of our question of Shabbos. So it's not. Let's take a look at the Mishnah that talks about the dimensions of something that mustn't be carried on Shabbos. The Mishnah says, kalaf, parchment, the exterior, the sturdier of the materials. How big of a scrap cannot be carried on Shabbos, says the Mishnah, the amount of space you need to write the smallest parsha, the smallest portion of tefillin, Shema Yisrael, and that is Shema Yisrael. So the Gemara says, look at this text. It says kalaf is used for tefillin, duchsustos loy, and duchsustos is not used for tefillin. If it was used, then the Mishnah would say kalaf v'duchsustos. So the Gemara answers, no, this is not going to help us because lemitzvah. It is the preferred manner to use the more durable, higher quality parchment for tefillin. The preferred way of doing the mitzvah is, of course, to use klaf. So therefore, being that the preferred use of tefillin of klaf, or the preferred material for tefillin is klaf, therefore on Shabbos we're going to assume that the default is a person is going to use klaf for the smaller parchment, the smaller parsha, and duchsustos, you're going to do it in an ideal way, you're not going to use for tefillin. But as far as the laws of tefillin, Rav's comment can remain that one may use duchsustos for tefillin. That's how Rav would defend his opinion. Again, la mitzvah, Rashi says mitzvah min hamuvchar, klaf, va'inon. To do the mitzvah in the preferred way, you need to use klaf. V'stama dechol inish mitzvah ma'al yisa avid. And the default, the assumption is that a person is going to do the mitzvah in the preferred manner. I would highlight this. This is a kind of Rashi that would be a good bumper sticker. It's the optimism in the devotion and the desire of a Jew to get things right. Therefore, a person would not store duchsustos in sizes for the tefillin. And therefore, people do not store such size parchments. So question asked and answered. Toshima, we're not done. We're going to pummel Rav again multiple times to try to challenge his comment. Toshima, halach l'moshe Sinai. Again, we did this yesterday. I'm repeating it because I want us to get it right. Halach l'moshe Sinai. We have a tradition dating back to Moshe, an oral tradition that says tefillin al klaf u'mezuzah al duchsustos. Tefillin is made on klaf and mezuzah is made on duchsustos. Again, this is the text that we spent a long time analyzing. Klaf, what is klaf? Klaf. I should say klaf. When you're using klaf, where do you write the words of the parsha b'makom basar? In the direction of the meat, on the opposite side of where the hair grows. Duchsustos, and when you use duchsustos, b'makom seyar, you write it where the hair is. This would seem to indicate again that tefillin is written exclusively on klaf. And how can Rav say that you are allowed to write tefillin on a duchsustos? Our answer is the same answer. The mitzvah. This is a text that describes the most preferred method of tefillin and mezuzahs, but it would be kosher yet, according to Rav, if you'd write a tefillin on a duchsustos. Same answer. Interestingly, the commentators ask, is it possible that we would have halacha l'moshe Sinai that's really just conveying a preferred method? And that's a question that is discussed elsewhere, but just wanted to. So now let's go to our third challenge to Rav. Vatanya, how do you tell me that Rav, how do you defend Rav's position? Again, Rav's position is simply you can use klaf and duchsustos for tefillin. That doesn't work because now we have a brisa that explicitly says shina pasul. If you mixed around the materials and you If you mixed around the materials, and then it's unkosher, it's disqualified. It sounds like to me that if you use the chsustus for tefillin, unlike the text of this brisa describing, the preferred method of doing tefillin, it's puzzle, and that's certainly a solid rejection of Rav's comment that you can use both materials for tefillin. Again, Vatanya, Shina puzzle. The Gemara gives an answer. Amizuzah. What we mean to say is that if you write Amizuzah on klaf, then it's disqualified. But if you wrote tefillin on the chsustos, that could still be kosher. I know this sounds confusing but basically you just have to always keep in mind that the preferred method is klaf, tefillin, the chsustos, mezuzos. That's what the Mishnah says. And all of these comments are to try to push back on Rav saying that you can use both materials for tefillin. So Shina Pasul, if you mix them both up, it's a problem. And the Gemara answers no. Maybe the problem would only be if you use the wrong material for mezuzah, it's unkosher. But if you use the other wrong material, the less preferred material for tefillin, it's still kosher. Gemara is not done. That can't work, says the Gemara. Vatanya, I've got another brisa, which explicitly says.
I don't know. Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
I may be missing something, and I apologize if I do.
No worries.
But if Shina Puzzle, I can understand if you write the tefillin on the lesser one. But why would the mezuzah be puzzle if you write it on the klaf, which is a better material? I mean, I understand it doesn't go according to tradition, but why would it be? Why would one be okay and the other not be okay, even though you're using a better material?
You're asking a good question. I think I shared with you a savara of why one material might be preferred over the other. Ultimately, the halacha l'moshe Sinai seems to be absent a reasoning. The halacha l'moshe Sinai says this is how you do it. Maybe the halacha l'moshe Sinai is to make sure we don't waste the chsustos and klaf. I don't know.
I have no problem with the halacha l'moshe Sinai. I just have a problem of saying one way is okay. If Shina one way, if you change one way is okay. But if you go the other way, even though the material is better, it's not okay.
So we need to temporarily forget. We need to temporarily forget the better.
Either tell me both are not okay. If you change one way and the other way, or at least have it contingent on the material. And if you go for a lesser material, it's not okay. But if you go for a better material, it's okay.
You're asking a good question. If the Gemara would stop here, your question would be a resounding question. Ultimately, the Gemara is like workshopping an issue. And so basically what the Gemara is doing is the Gemara is workshopping. Can Rav's interpretation stand? Rav would be a dochik. It would be inconvenient to read it like this. Shina Pasal Mezuzah. That would be an inconvenient reading. But we could still project, Rav could still comfortably read the brisa and have a way that his opinion is not is able to stand. It's not comfortable. It's maybe not ideal. But at this point, Rav is not mortally his idea is not totally negated by this comment because Shina could mean about a mezuzah. But the reason why we probably shouldn't get too caught up on this is because the Gemara is going to right away bring another brisa which explicitly says Shina bazel bazel. And so I think had the Gemara not had a brisa, we would want to. Your question would be a good one. But I think it's kind of like we're workshopping through issues and we're seeing how far Rav can go. And eventually we may be compelled to somewhat moderate or modify how we understand Rav's opinion. So
Rabbi,
yes, Rabbi.
Rabbi, I'm trying to think of, in the context of the time, there was no alternative to parchment at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So my guess might be what's going on is there's all kinds of parchments on the market, good, bad, medium, damaged, not damaged, and they had to find a clear path. I don't know how much later paper came about, but certainly not at these times.
Yeah, that's again. I don't know. I don't know if we can say that's certainly the perspective of the Gemara, but that certainly helps us out. The Gemara was the Jewish people found the preferred use for each of the kinds of materials. Again, I want to be careful. I don't want to claim that is why these halachas are so, but it certainly is helpful. After the fact, it certainly is helpful that we have uses for each of the different materials. If I'd find a Rishon, if I find an earlier source that makes that comment, then I would feel comfortable with it. But now I just want that to be like, I don't want to use this as the reasoning, but it's a very convenient fact, and it helps the market, and it certainly helped. I'm sure it helped create a whole industry, a whole parnasa. So that's certainly the case. That there are different materials, and in Jewish tradition, each one had its use. So shkayach for that. Did I miss something or?
No, it's fine.
Okay, shkayach. So that's. So the Gemara right away. The Gemara right away says no. Hold on. Tanya, we have another brayso that says explicitly shina bazeh ubazeh. If you made a change, either direction, either you made a change with klaf or duchsusas for tefillin or klaf for mezuzah, they are both problematic. So the Gemara tries to answer, no. Idi v'idi amezuzah. When it says shina bazeh ubazeh, if you made either change, it's unkosher. We're actually talking both about a mezuzah. So now, doctor, again, what's going on over here? So let's see how the Gemara explains it. Do you remember that we said that on the klaf, which is, again, the piece of parchment that comes from the hair side, you write on the inside, on the basar side, and on the duchsustas that comes near the basar, you write on the hair side. So the Gemara is going to now try to say, shina bazeh ubazeh. If you messed up in either direction, it's puzzle. We're talking about idi v'idi amezuzah. And what we mean is, if you wrote on the klaf on the wrong side, then you wrote on the wrong side. That's one way that Rav would yet be able to kvetch in the brayso, and the brayso is not a rejection of his teaching. Now, Rav himself, by the way, is not having this conversation. You understand what's happening? We have a teaching from Rav, and the sages of the Gemara are workshopping Rav's position and to see if it can withstand all these different earlier sources which seem to reject or negate Rav. At the end of the conversation, we'll either have clarity on the definition of these sources, or we'll have clarity on the position of Rav. So right now, we have found a way to read the brayso, and it's not a rejection of Rav. Let's read Rashi for a moment. The kasav aklaf afilu b'makom seyar. B'kol shekain b'makom basar. The hilchasa mezuzah b'makom seyar. No, I think this is a later Rashi. No, it's possible that Rashi had a different gear. So hold on, give me 1 second, please. It's possible that Rashi had a different gear of the Gemara. I want to just see if that's the case. All right, let's see the Gemara. Iva Yisema, an alternative way to defend, to explain Rav. The Iva Yisema, Shina bazeh bazeh tanoihi. How do we have Rav? How does Rav's word stand in the face of a brayso that says whether you mess up and use the wrong parchment for tefillin or you use the wrong parchment for mezuzah, it's unkosher? So again, we're now saying alternatively, we'll read the brayso as is. We're not going to use the kvetch that we're talking about writing on the wrong side of the page. Ibais ema tanoihi. This is really a machlokes between two tanoim, as we know. A sage of the Gemara does not have the authority, does not have the power to undo, overturn, or negate a Mishnah, a sage of the Mishnah, a Tana. But two sages of the Mishnah can have different opinions, and both opinions stand. So the Ibais Ema Tanoihi. Alternatively, this can be that Rav was embracing another Mishnaic opinion. The Tanya, how do we know? How do we see that this could be a machlokes of Tanoim? The Tanya, we have a brayso that says, Shina bazeh bazeh pasul. If you made either change, you messed up tefillin, or you messed up a mezuzah by using the wrong material. You went to the store and you're the sofer, and you go buy a package of parchment that's for mezuzahs, and when you come home, you see, oh, it's made for tefillin. I'm not sure if that's how it worked, but you know. Puzzle. Rav Acha machshir. Rav Acha, however, permits such mix-ups. Mishum Rabbi Acha bar Chanina, and this was a teaching that he brought in the name of Rabbi Achai bar Chanina, for Amina Mishum Rabbi Yaakov bar Chanina, or alternatively from Yaakov in the name of Rabbi Chanina. And so therefore, Rav will say, you're going to tell me that my position is incorrect because there's a brisa that negates, that argues with me, but no problem, because there's another brisa that agrees with me. There's another opinion in the Mishnah that agrees with me. And therefore, Rav is a second way that Rav is not perturbed by a brisa that seems to disagree with him. Now, some of you may ask a question that I'm asking myself right now, which is, Reb Beryl, what do we say about it? Do you remember what we said about Rav? Or actually, maybe, I don't know if you were with us when we said this, but Mark, do you remember what we said about Rav? Remember we read a whole story about Rav, who was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he had his nephew, Rav Acha, or was it his uncle? We say Rav Tano Polig. Rav is considered a Tana. Rav has the authority of a sage of the Mishnah.
Even though he's Rav and not Rabbi.
Right, so why don't we say Rav Tano Polig? Why don't we just say that Rav is a Tana and you can't argue with him?
Or was he was somewhere in between?
I'm sorry?
Maybe was he in between? Like he was almost the Tana, but he was in the next group.
He lived in the transitional stage. He lived basically in the era, he lived in between the final generation of the sages of the Mishnah, and also because he was a student of Rabbi, so his Rabbi and his students were involved in the formation of the Mishnah. And then there has to be a cutoff date, and he lived between both eras. So I don't know what the answer is. I'll assume that maybe we could have said that Rav is a Tana, but we found an actual brisa, so that was more advantageous. There may be another explanation, but I'm missing it in the moment. Let me just see if anyone else says this.
What may be more interesting is why does he hold his position?
Okay. What do you mean?
Why? What is the point that he is making that they're having a problem with?
Well, the point that he's making is a simple one. He's of the opinion that you can use either material b'diavad for tefillin and mezuzahs.
Right.
So the Gemara is like curious. Is that really so? It sounds a little strange. We have a halacha l'moshe Sinai, and Rav is holding his own. Rav doesn't say that Rav is not going to argue that it's preferred to use each of the materials for each thing. But if you did b'diavad,
it's the question whether it's puzzle or not.
Yeah, listen, it's an important question. If you buy a pair of tefillin and you bring it to the sofer, and the sofer says, "I'm sorry to break the news to you, but your parshias are written on dursustas, so you have to throw them out." And not throw them out. Do you put them in shemis, or can you keep on wearing your tefillin? That's an important question. All right, let's see. The Gemara gives a third answer. How Rav may not be in trouble with the brises that seem to explicitly say Shina Bazel Bazapasal. Rav Papa gave an answer as follows. Rav, the Omar Ketana de Beimenashe. Rav was embraced the position of Beimenashe, another Mishnaic authority which supports him. The Tana de Beimenashe, here's the teaching. Kosova al haniyar the al hamatlis. If a person wrote the parchment for the tefillin on paper, niyar shel asovim, something akin to the papyrus that we looked at a few days ago, or on matlis, or another kind of material, on cloth.
I would assume that matlit probably refers to a piece of cloth.
It's a cloth, yeah. Pisula, that's unkosher. Ala cloth, the al hagvil, the al dursustus. But if you wrote it on cloth or gvil or dursustus, it is kosher. The problem we have now is, what is it? What is it?
Oh,
So let's.
Or is it mezuzah?
Right, it doesn't say. We don't in this citation. We don't have kasvamai. So the Gemara says, what material are we talking about? Ilema mezuzah. If we're talking about mezuzah, Mezuzah klaf mikasvinon. Are you ever allowed to write a mezuzah on klaf? We have a strong tradition, including many sources that we've read, that mezuzahs are written on duchsustos. Dr. Stamler, I know your question gets reactivated here, but let's leave it on the side for the moment. Elalav tefillin. Rather, we must be talking about tefillin. Now let's be careful. Let's take a look. Tefillin agvil mikasvinon. Are you really allowed to write? Are you allowed to write tefillin? I'm sorry. Elalav tefillin. Therefore, Rav would say that this text is telling us that you're allowed to write tefillin on either material, which supports Rav's position. Rav is embracing the opinion of the Beit Menashe. For the time, the Gemara says that doesn't work. Because let's think together. Let's put on our thinking caps. Tefillin on gvil mikasvinon. Are you ever allowed to write tefillin on gvil? Seemingly not. Ella kitanya hi b'sefer Torah. Rather, this text that we quoted is talking about a sefer Torah. It's talking about a sefer Torah. And therefore, being that this is possibly talking about a sefer Torah, Rav loses. So Rav Papa's assertion, Rav Papa's defense of Rav, this third one falls off. So the Gemara says, okay, but maybe we can find the defense for Rav. Let's read another source. The Brisa reads as follows. Tefillin shabalu. It's a Brisa about if you're allowed to exchange. Well, let's see. What happens if your tefillin start wearing out? The Sefer Torah shabalu, or a Sefer Torah that gets worn out. Ein oisa mehem mezuzah. So what happens if your Torah is going bad? It happens. It starts breaking down. The parchment is having holes in it. The ksav is falling off. So it's you have to put it in shemis. Are you allowed to go run into the shul and say, hold on, before we put it in shemis, let's go to the parsha of Shema. Let's cut it out. And we'll put it in a tefillin. We'll recycle the parchment to make it a mezuzah. Or the tefillin shal yad, where you have it all in one piece of parchment, you cut it off and you make a mezuzah. So the Brisa says you're not allowed to do it. Ein oisa mehem mezuzah. You're prohibited from making a mezuzah. Why? Because you're not allowed to downgrade. Something that's holy cannot be repurposed for something of a lesser degree of sanctity.
Rabbi.
Hold on. Go ahead, Ron. Go ahead.
I was always wondering, the people who repair Sefer Torahs, because we have lots of them, I'm sure, and we're not the only place, are they allowed to take portions of one Torah, replace them in another?
I believe it's a good question, and I really should punt, but I believe hypothetically you could, if they align and they're the right size, and I believe one could. I'm not saying that one should, but it's
no, because you're talking at times when we have 4 different Sefer Torahs that somebody's repairing, and I always wondered.
I don't think it's common practice, but I think hypothetically, let's say you have a mezuzah a Torah that the beginning is damaged, then you could hypothetically, I think you could possibly fuse the two. There are other considerations that one would need to take into account. I'll tell you.
Let me
go ahead, Jeremiah.
So I just want to clarify to myself. So if you have a Sefer Torah, you can't take the portion out and put it into a tefillin because in Moedim Megdusha.
Yeah.
Can you take a Sefer Torah and completely rework the parchment and eliminate the writing on it, which I don't know if that would be allowed, to rework it completely and then reuse it as a parchment for a Sefer Torah?
It's a good question. I do not believe that one could totally erase. You can't recycle.
I mean, once it's puzzle, it has a certain amount of kedusha but I would assume it would be quite low on the scale on the scale of sanctity. So would you be able to upgrade actually by reprocessing and you're upgrading it to a higher degree of sanctity?
Again, and not in my expertise, but I do not believe that one could do so. I do not believe that you could fix and repair and write over to, rewrite a word that's fading, but I don't believe that you could just strip a Torah and then rewrite it. I don't believe that's acceptable. But let's get back. Let's try to get into the mind of our Gemara for a moment, because the Gemara is in the middle of a thought process. So again, can we defend Rav? Can we assert that mezuzahs that you can write a tefillin on either material? A tefillin on either material. So lema misayele. Can this give us some support for Rav? Kayoytze boy. Let's read Rashi. Reisha de Braisa. The beginning of a Braisa that we read. Tefillin shal yad oisen oisen shal rosh. Oh, I'm sorry. Reisha de Braisa. Rashi says, let me give you some background. Rashi doesn't always do this. This is interesting. This is another question that I was expecting someone to bring up. Tefillin shal yad oisen oisen shal rosh. Let's not get into the specific mechanics today. I think it would be a little hard to do so. But plausibly, you could upgrade. You could repurpose stuff from the tefillin shal yad and turn it into a tefillin shal rosh. But v'oison shal rosh ein oison shal yad. L'fisha ein maridin. The understanding in halacha is that the tefillin shal rosh has a higher degree of sanctity than the tefillin shal yad. As a matter of fact, we had this reference in a Gemara that we learned earlier on. Does anyone recall what's special about a tefillin shal rosh over the tefillin shal yad?
On a more important part of the body, the head versus the arm.
But what else?
They're also separated, but
it has the shin. It has Hashem's name, more spelled out than the shal yad.
Anyways, because the shal yad is a continuous piece of parchment.
So if you recall, when I was reading Rashi, I said I don't want to go into the mechanics of how you might repurpose parts from the shal yad because that's a good question. But just generally speaking, the shal rosh is considered to have a greater degree of sanctity, and therefore you cannot take stuff from the shal rosh and repurpose it in the shal yad, but you can take stuff from the shal yad and repurpose it and upgrade it, if you will, to become part of the shal rosh. That's what the Braisa says. So again, the Braisa is discussing repurposing of stam, repurposing of sefer Torahs, mezuzah, tefillin, when and if and how you could possibly repurpose or upgrade stuff from one use to another. The Braisa says you're allowed to upgrade from shal yad to shal rosh. The hand tefillin can be repurposed for the head tefillin. The head tefillin cannot be repurposed for the hand. And then the Braisa continues and says, you know what else? You're not allowed to take from a tefillin, a Torah, or a tefillin and turn them into mezuzah, because that would be considered a downgrade. Rashi, sefer Torah shel bala, ein mechatchin mimeno, yiriyah sheparshi shema v'hayim shemaya, l'kayvam b'mezuzah. You're not allowed to cut out the part of the Torah that has shema v'hayim shemaya and put it in the mezuzah. Now, whoever's thinking, I don't know how this works. This doesn't sound like a mezuzah that we have today, because our mezuzah is a single sheet. It has on it the shema and v'haya. And the Torah, as you may know, does not have shema and v'haya. They're not continuous. They're an entire Torah portion apart, right? Veschanan and Ekev. Which is Mark's Bar Mitzvah Parsha, right? So I don't know I don't know the mechanics. I don't know how it works. I have a feeling that this is an area where maybe some of the commentaries have a little bit of a field day understanding Rashi. But let's take Rashi. Let's take the Gemara at face value. Let's assume that there is a way, as Rashi explains, that you could take from the you could take from the Torah and put it into the mezuzah. So that's what the text says. Now let's see how the Gemara analyzes this text. The whole reason why you're not allowed to use a piece of a tefillin or a parsha of tefillin to become part of a mezuzah, or a piece of the Torah in a mezuzah, the whole issue is because it would be a downgrade. But hypothetically, if there wasn't the issue of downgrading, absent the issue of using a holy item for something of lesser holiness, you'd be allowed to do it. What is it written on? is not the tefillin written on the sustos. Why? Because that's the only material that's kosher for a mezuzah. So again, let's go through this again. It's I think it sounds more confusing than it is. We said you're not allowed to take from a tefillin and put it in a mezuzah because you're not allowed to diminish the sanctity of the parchment and the words on it. So the Gemara says, hold on. Why is the issue only diminishing kedusha? There should be another issue, which is which material it's written on. From the fact that we don't say, hey, this is written on the wrong material, we can infer that the tefillin may be written on doxostos, because otherwise it would never be kosher as a mezuzah. That's how the Gemara wants to reason. Now, as you can already imagine, maybe you don't have the words, but you could already understand the Gemara is not going to take this standing up. Loi, the Gemara says, no, I'll explain you the Braisa in a different way. Dichsiva al klaf. You wrote the tefillin on the only material that's permissible to write tefillin on, which is klaf. Okay, mezuzah klaf mikasfinan. Are you allowed to write a mezuzah on klaf? So, doctor, I think here's where we might see something that's going to give you we're going to get a hat tip or the nod of the to you. Yes, you're allowed to. But Tanya Kosval klaf al nir v'matlis psula. Didn't we read that if you wrote a mezuzah on klaf or paper or a material, it's unkosher? In truth, there's another Mishnaic opinion that says that you could write a mezuzah on klaf, and therefore this text is not a proof to Rav, because Rav says that you could write tefillin on any material. But I'll explain to you that this brisa is talking actually the reverse, that you wrote a mezuzah on klaf, because you could never write a tefillin on doxostos. Rav, I don't know what you're talking about. That's what the Gemara says. So the Gemara goes, now that we've come this far, and then we've established that a tefillin can be written on a klaf. We must now re-evaluate our own understanding of Rav's statement. So we're basically going to go back to the top of the Gemara, reread Rav's words and say, maybe we got it wrong. Now we got to read it again. Klaf harehu kiduchsostos. Klaf is like duchsostos. How so? Not about tefillin. Ma duchsostos koisven olav mezuzah. Just like a mezuzah is written on duchsostos, af klaf koisven olav mezuzah.
Rabbi.
Hold on. This is a mic drop moment in the Gemara. So let me just, Rabbi, give me a moment. So let's scroll back to the top. Let's scroll back to the top of the page. And if now you'll think about it, when I introduced this yesterday, I was very careful to show you this false. Amar Rav, let's go back to the top. Duchsostos hareyu klaf. We have a teaching from Rav that says duchsostos and klaf have something very much in common. And then the Gemara says, ma klaf koisen osfon. And I said, who says this comment? And I explained to you that this wasn't explicitly in the words of Rav. This was the Gemara's understanding. Why did I tell you that? Because in the end of the Gemara totally re-evaluates its own understanding of the words of Rav. So for whatever reason, we were strongly inclined. We really wanted to say that Rav is permitting putting tefillin on klaf. But now that we went through all these different texts, and although they weren't all necessarily profound knockouts to Rav, but it didn't sit well. And we've actually found another text which tells us that a mezuzah can be written interchangeably. So now that we know that, we should go back to Rav and understand that he was really talking about interchangeably writing a mezuzah on either material, but not interchangeably writing a tefillin on either material. Now,
Rabbi.
Okay, Rabbi, go ahead.
So if we're not allowed to downgrade, are we to presume that you're allowed to upgrade? That you could take something from tefillin and then make a mezuzah?
No. So you're asking a good question, but we just don't have a plausible way, because we have a hierarchy of kedusha: a Torah, tefillin, mezuzah. Torah, tefillin, mezuzah. So you're not. So here you cannot turn a tefillin into a Torah, right? There's not enough extra paper in the tefillin. But your question, which I think you mean to ask, is: so now can we take a mezuzah and put it into tefillin? Can we cut the Shema paragraph and put in the Shalosh? Can we cut the V'hayim Shemoya and put in the Tefillin Shalosh? As
You
a matter of
could upgrade.
that would be an upgrade. So as a matter of practice, I don't believe that's done. But again, without having recently reviewed this whole discussion, it's a big sugya. It's plausible that one could go from a tefillin, assuming that it's the same parchment or it's kosher. That is, so if you wrote a klaf on a tefillin, on a mezuzah, then according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, you should be allowed to take the parchment from the mezuzah, and you should be able to put it into tefillin. Again, I just want to leave. So here we have a Gemara that we went through a bunch of different text sources talking about which material you use to fill in or mezuzah. What's clear is as follows. Ideally, tefillin are written on klaf. Mezuzah is written on the sustas. Can you exchange? Well, at this point in the Gemara, it sounds like we'd be comfortable giving the upgrade. And this was Rabbi Menachem's question in the beginning of our shir today. Why couldn't you upgrade it to fill mezuzah to a higher grade material? Right? That was really your question. And ultimately, at the beginning of the Gemara, it didn't work. But ultimately, your position is strongly endorsed by the end of our Gemara. I just wanted to just point out where we have some questions that remain, technical questions. For me, I don't know if these are questions in the world, but things that bother me. So I want to understand exactly how Rashi understands taking a parchment from, how you could even plausibly take a parchment from the tefillin and turn it into a mezuzah. We can't, but how would that even work? So I don't know what that answer is. Now there's another Tosfos I wanted to show you. Let's take a look at Tosfos. Tosfos says what I was saying more explicitly. So before we end the Gemara, I would feel more comfortable. Hashta the asas lahachi. Right? We said hashta asas lahachi. Now that we've come to this point, let's reimagine Rav's comment. Re-explain this as follows. Rav had an open-ended comment. What was his comment? The klaf. He said they're the same. Our initial understanding, which is the understanding of the bulk of today's Gemara, is that tefillin kamar. And that didn't work out. So now we assert that we were talking about mezuzah. But now Tosfos says, hold on, remember, we're going to still have a problem. Didn't we have a comment that says that either changing either way is unkosher? So now we're going to say idi v'idi at tefillin. It's going to now have to be two different possible ways of messing up with tefillin. But mezuzah can be written on either material. So Tosfos says we don't relitigate the whole sugya the way we did about the tefillin, about our new assertion that he was talking about mezuzah. But suffice it to say, because Rav's comments were a little bit unexplained, for whatever reason, there was a preference to understand it to be talking about tefillin. When we were unable to establish that to be the case, we were able to reimagine and understand Rav's comment to be the context of tefillin. Tosfos, I know I must have seen it, but let's see Tosfos, because I read Rashi and I told you that I didn't understand how would you repurpose, right? This is the Rashi. Rashi says, you're not allowed to chop out from the Torah Shema and V'haya and put it into a mezuzah, right? That's what Rashi said. And I told you, I don't get this. How does this work? Well, Tosfos asked that question. Although, as Mark can attest, there's a big distance, or I don't want to say big, there's a considerable distance. There's many lines and columns in between Shema and V'hayim Shema. Oisin to come, or what does it mean that you would turn a Torah into a tefillin? In Parsha Shema Kisuva, b'soif ha'amud, yichtav achareh V'hayim Shema b'gilyon. Very simply, let's say Shema is at the bottom of the column. So you know how there is a margin underneath the Parsha. In a Torah, there's a margin. So you'd cut out Shema and you'd preserve the margin, and then you write underneath it V'hayim Shemaya. Parshas V'hayim Shemaya b'reish amud. And alternatively, if V'haya was on top of the page, yichtav lemala b'gilyon Parsha Shema. You'll put on the top of the Parsha Shema, you write it in, which is probably even easier, because as we know, Shema is shorter than V'hayim Shemaya. So Tosfos answers our question beautifully. It's not that you'd be repurposing both the Shema and the V'haya, but you could tack onto the Shema V'haya or V'haya Shema. That's a good answer. I mean, it's plausible. Now let's take a look at Rashi. It's possible that's what Rashi understands. he doesn't say it. So he doesn't elaborate. We read Rashi and said, "Oh, it's just you cut out both." But Tosfos saves the day. Tosfos gives us a good explanation. By this Tosfos, no, this is the Marsha. Hold on, I think the Marsha addresses a little bit of Mark's question, but I'm not sure if we're going to go into it now. All right, there was one more Tosfos though that I do want to show you. Just let me find it now. So we're not going to start the next Gemara.
Rabbi,
Yes.
since I'm getting this whole education on parchment, and I know nothing about it, so I could be way off base, but if it's made from the hide of animals, are we careful which animal our particular parchment comes from?
Yes. Yes. There's only specific parchments that are from kosher animals, and there are actually preferred animals. And once upon a time, they were frequently on. If you look around, I think, depending on the region in the world, will depend on which kind of hide you have available to yourself. And also, the different hides have different degrees of durability. And so, once upon a time, there were many Torahs, I believe, on deer skin. Once upon a time.
Because I could envisage a scenario where you would have parchment made from a non-kosher animal.
That would be disqualified for a Torah.
So they would check on that, right?
Well, yeah, they would source it lechatchila from a kosher. Right. And I think it's purely. I think those that are in the industry can tell which animal a hide comes from by eyeballing it.
Yeah, you have deer skin, goat skin, wallets, etc.
Right, and you can, maybe we couldn't, or I couldn't figure it out, but the pros, if you're in the business, you can look at it and know right away. Kind of like the professor's comments the other day about eyeballing something and having a fairly accurate determination.
I can see why they get the price they get for a Sefer Torah.
Yeah. Hold on. I wanted to show you something. Bear with me just a moment. All right, I'll have to find. I'm not finding it now, so I think we're gonna draw our session to a close. Just to show you, tomorrow, Be'ezer Hashem, we'll resume studying the Gemara, and we'll turn the page to 80a, and we're going to begin the analysis of the words of the Mishnah that talk about how much ink is considered enough ink that's worth preserving. How much ink would you be interested in carrying? Well, today it's the amount of ink that probably fills up a tube in a pen. Right? But once upon a time, ink was much more valuable, and it was used with much more precision and of greater value. And so the Mishnah says, the Mishnah says that the amount of ink that writes for you 2 letters. And so tomorrow, Mirz Hashem, we'll study some more about what kind of ink, how much ink, where's the ink, etc. As you can imagine, the Gemara can do. So just do a very fast recap of today's Gemara. Again, today's Gemara ends a 3-day unit on parchment. Now that we've spent a lot of time defining what the 2 types of parchments are, and the Gemara explained to us that a Torah is written on Gvil, which is the whole hide. That's not in the Gemara. Well, it's in the Gemara today, but a tefillin is ideally written on Klaf, and the mezuzah is written ideally on the sustos. And Rav says you can use either. The Gemara understood it to be talking about tefillin. That tefillin could be on either material. The Gemara brings a series of Mishnahs and Brisas, which each point to negate Rav's position. Aside for 2 opinions, 2 explanations that actually allow Rav's opinion to be somewhat consistent with the Brisas. For the most part, it's pretty clear that our understanding of Rav is not supported by the text that we bring up, and therefore the Gemara, to very close, tells us to flip the script and understand that you can write mezuzah on either material, but tefillin not so. And that is the close, and that is the conclusion of our discussion about parchment. I don't know about you, but I walk out of this 3-day series on parchment enlightened both about how it's made, what it looks like, as well as how complicated it is to have and source the correct kosher material for tefillin and mezuzahs. And let me just tell you, with Hashem's help, we're going to spend many tractates from now, Be'ezer Hashem, with good health and good circumstances. Maseches Menachos has vast discussions about tefillin, the material, and many of the halachos are actually from there. So with Hashem's help, we're not done talking about tefillin and mezuzahs. This was just a little teaser, a little sneak peek that came up parenthetically in the context of the laws of Shabbos and what you can and can't carry. This, my dear friends, concludes today's Gemara. Again, we dedicated today's learning Lili Nishmas, Mordechai HaKoyin ben Nachum Tzvi, and prayers for the healing of Leah Basrita, and prayers for healing of Harav Shim ben Halevi ben Leah, and Lili Nishmas, Daniel Yerachmiel ben Toiva Basha, and Aya Yaakov ben Litzman. Wishing everyone a wonderful day. And
Shkoyach, chodesh tov.
Agut Chodesh, Agut Yah. Thank you. Shalom Ber will be doing the Chumash. As soon as we end this link, you're welcome to rejoin and study Chumash with Rabbi Shalom Ber. Parshas Noach, 5th Aliyah.